Happy Emancipation Day, everybody. My name is Rochelle Bush, and I'm a trustee and the church historian for the Salem Chapel British Methodist Episcopal Church, Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Historic Site. It is an honor for me to participate in the 186th Emancipation Day celebration. Right now, we're standing outside of the back entrance of the Salem Chapel. It's an honor for me to participate in the 186th Annual Emancipation Day. I also want to make note that I'm the owner and operator of Tubman Tours Canada. This level is dedicated to our most famous member, Harriet Tubman, and right now I'd like to take you for a walk around the lower level. What we have here is a display that indicates our position about the history of the Underground Railroad. So, the Underground Railroad is legendary. We all know about that. People of African descent who were enslaved in the United States were self-liberated. They connected themselves with a secret network of people who operated the Underground Railroad in order to find freedom. The Underground Railroad network would help pilot freedom seekers to the free northern states as well as to Canada. Many people put down roots in various parts of Canada West, my family included. My connection to the Salem Chapel is that my 2 times great-grandfather was the minister in charge for a period of time when Harriet Tubman was here. My great-grandfather was living as a free black in South Carolina. He arrived here in 1838. He was only 26 years old as a traveling AME minister. After the United States government passed the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, he returned to collect his wife and his children, and they put down roots here in St. Catharines. So getting back to the first disclaimer that I mentioned about the Underground Railroad, the Underground Railroad was a secret network of people. It was a secret society, and it was illegal activity. Those that participated in the Underground Railroad were breaking the law. If caught, they could be returned to slavery. Free blacks I'm speaking about. White people could be imprisoned. They could lose their property, they could lose their finance. So a lot of people were putting themselves at risk during this time. This disclaimer indicates that we stand with the history of the Underground Railroad when it was written. So I'm talking about the 19th century because a lot of it is based on oral history. Scholars today who are documenting these accounts, they have to go by their standard and discipline, which means they can only agree and support most times with what is on paper. I say that because the narrative of Harriet Tubman has changed. Prior to 2004, her narrative used to be she guided 300 people to Canada. She made 11 rescue missions from St. Catharines, going back to Maryland, guiding people to St. Catharines. In 2004, when scholars began to research, they found out and they determined and they believe that she guided 70 people and instructed 70 people. She gave them directions as to how to make it to St. Catharines. Well, going back to the Underground Railroad being unlawful activity, we can't support that. We support both. So we are thankful for what the scholars have produced today, but we also support what our ancestors and others said during that time, primarily because Harriet Tubman never argued against it. This is her first reward poster. In 1849, she learned that she was going to be sold off. She was born Araminta Ross. Her nickname was Minty. She was married in 1849. She determined that if she was going to be separated from her family, it would be on her terms and conditions, not her enslavers. So she escaped. This wanted poster indicates that she was escaping with 2 brothers. They did so. They were away from their enslaver's home, which we call the plantation, for a couple of weeks. Then they decided, you know what? They wanted to go back home. Harriet Tubman, of course, resisted, but they made her return anyways. The brother did that because they were separating from their families. That was a difficult thing to do for enslaved people. When they were told that they were going to be sold off, that meant they would be separated from their loved ones forever and never see them again. When Tubman learned afterwards, when they returned back to the plantation, that she was going to be sold off as a single individual, she made the determination to escape on her own. Her husband, John Tubman, at the time, did not want to go north with her, and he didn't support her idea of freedom. So again, she was married to a free black man. She was enslaved. The wanted poster in 1849 for the capture of her and her two brothers, their value was $100 apiece. We're just going to move a little bit forward. She escaped in 1849 and she settled in Philadelphia. While she was living there, the U.S. government passed the Fugitive Slave Bill. From its early beginning, enslavers, along with the United States government, constantly protested about the provisions in the United States Constitution. A clause that was put forth in the 1793 Constitution indicated that any fugitives or runaways would be returned to their enslaver, their slave master. So Harriet Tubman was living in Philadelphia as a free black person when the U.S. government passed the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. This act meant that slave catchers, bounty hunters, law enforcement, U.S. Marshals would have the freedom to roam around the free northern states. It became a haven for slave catchers to capture people who may have been runaway slaves or alleged to be runaway slaves. So it was a simple accusation, that's all that was needed. People of African descent would be captured, tried, convicted without a judge and a jury, and returned to slavery. But there were incidents where free black people, such as the story of Solomon Northrop, 12 years a slave. He was a free black man, he was born free, and he was kidnapped, accused of being a runaway or a fugitive, and enslaved for the first time. White people who were living in the free northern states were now bound by law to assist slave catchers or law enforcement when it came to the apprehension of people who were accused of being fugitives. This, of course, upset many because they had the ability to live in the northern states freely and ignore what was happening in the southern states. And what I mean by that is the enslavement of people of African descent. So it wasn't right up under their nose, so they turned a blind eye to it. Now the change in the law with the Fugitive Slave Act forced them to pay attention. And in addition, they were bound by law, and if they didn't participate or they refused to assist, they could be tried, convicted, jailed, imprisoned, right? Or fined. So that was their punishment. So that law really riled white people in the North as well. Because of that law, free black people started to relocate primarily to Canada West. Harriet Tubman herself, a year later, escaped to Canada. This here, notice, indicates that Harriet Tubman, it's her first rescue. In 1849, when she was living in Philadelphia, she learned that her niece, Keziah Boley, was going to be sold on the Cambridge auction block. Tubman decided that she would return to Maryland in aid in her rescue, and she did. So she brought Keziah and her two children to Philadelphia. A year later, December 1851, she escapes with 11 freedom seekers and settles in St. Catharines. That's a well-documented account. Scholars today believe that notations in Frederick Douglass's biography, where it indicates that he sheltered 11 freedom seekers, they believe it was the same incident. They believe that Harriet Tubman stopped at his home in Rochester, New York with 11 freedom seekers before she arrived in St. Catharines. This is a picture of one of the members of our black community, an unknown individual. And this a picture, as well as many others that are in the lower level here, are held at the Special Collections Department at Brock University. So Frederick Douglass, I'll make mention of him again as we walk around the lower level. This is an image of, actually a drawing that was in Ebony magazine in the 1970s, and it depicts Harriet Tubman with 11 freedom seekers crossing the first suspension bridge in the Niagara Falls area. And this is a picture of that suspension bridge. So this bridge and this crossing predates the construction of the Whirlpool suspension bridge. Actually, it was called the Railroad Suspension Bridge, which is now located at the lower level Whirlpool Bridge. This is an 1852 map of St. Catharines, and if you look at it closely, it identifies some of the street names that are different than they are today. This, of course, is a picture of Harriet Tubman, the old courthouse in downtown St. Catharines, which was used for a lot of abolitionist activities, and I'll address that as well. This display here is about the 1852 Militia Day riot. A parade was taking place in 1852, so visualize this. Tubman is newly arrived. So it's about June. There's a parade going downtown. Black men are dressed in British military gear, red coats. Some white people didn't like that, in particular white men. So of course, they were outraged. A race riot ensued after the parade. Some of the white people, and it's awful to think about it, that's why I'm pausing, were so outraged that they burnt down our colored village. Because that's what the area was labeled, the colored village. We were on the outskirts of town, kind of segregated, so they burnt down a large portion of the colored village. A year later, the town council decided, you know what, they would finance the rebuilding or the reconstruction of this neighborhood. And they did, which was great. William Hamilton Merritt, the father of transportation. He had many businesses. He was a member of parliament, but more importantly, he was one of the primary benefactors for the black community. The property that we are on was sold to the black community, the congregational members of the AME church at the time, for £5. Zion Baptist Church labeled him the benefactor of the black community. He was a strong abolitionist, a leading abolitionist, and to me, he was Niagara's #1 white male abolitionist. This is part of the 2 images of the canal, the early canal, the first Welland Canal. This display here is about Mary Ann Shadd Cary. She became the first female publisher of African descent in North America. She was a staunch abolitionist. She was an educator. She was a teacher. She lived in southwestern Ontario, but she traveled to St. Catharines on numerous occasions because her sister was living here, her sister Amelia, who was married to an entrepreneur, David Williamson, who was a jeweler in St. Catharines. David Williamson actually had a jewelry business on St. Paul Street here in St. Catharines. So Mary Ann Shadd, she was the publisher, and she published the Provincial Freeman. So this is information about a few of her publications, and they speak to what she said about St. Catharines. Here you'll see that she says that St. Catharines was riddled with Negrophobia. Sure, Canada was a gateway to freedom. We had our rights here, so my ancestors had their rights here. They could have housing without discrimination, they could go to court, they could take somebody to court if they chose to, they could vote. They had many liberties here that they did not have in the United States, but that did not prevent discrimination. It did not prevent or stop prejudice in the area. And when Mary Ann Shadd came here, she thought, you know what, there's something wrong with this picture. This town is riddled with Negrophobia. And she wrote an article about it, alerting people about the conditions in St. Catharines. So you had white abolitionists who were very good here in the city, or the town at the time, and you had a lot of racist individuals who did not want black folks in this area. That's just one article. She also addresses the school board system. She said that it was nothing but Negro haters who were preventing blacks from having a formal education. And she railed against that on several occasions. This is Samuel Ringgold Ward, who was also one of her colleagues. And he too was a staunch abolitionist. And when he arrived in St. Catharines in 1854, he said it was the most Yankee town in Canada. So this is a picture of Harriet Tubman's brother, William Henry Stewart. He arrived with Harriet Tubman and 2 other brothers in 1854. This is a famous rescue. It was called the Raid on Christmas, and it actually included 10 freedom seekers. So Harriet Tubman guided 10 people, including her 3 brothers, to St. Catharines in December 1854. So this is about their rescue mission, because it's not all about Harriet Tubman and the people she rescued. We have other notations on display to indicate those that arrived without Tubman, and one such person is Adam Nicholson. Adam Nicholson escaped from Virginia and made it to St. Catharines in April 1854. He put down roots here in the Grantham area, which was another outskirt of the town. So this colored village was here, and it was part of St. Catharines. The Grantham Township was on the outskirts of the area, so it was about 3 miles out, and there they were predominantly farmers. So Adam Nicholson actually settled there first, and a couple of years later, Harriet Tubman's brother settled close by him. A white abolitionist by the name of Benjamin Drew arrived in St. Catharines in the spring of 1855. Abolitionists in the United States, so the free northern states, were outraged because a book was published. It was called The South Side View of Slavery. It was a justification about the enslavement of people of African descent. So it was their reasoning why it was okay to enslave black people. Drew, a staunch abolitionist, decided to challenge their claims, and he wrote a book called The North Side View of Slavery. He came here to St. Catharines and he interviewed Harriet Tubman and her three brothers. And this is her narrative that was included in that 1856 publication. In this account that was delivered from St. Catharines is Tubman's most famous quote that is used frequently by people, where she indicates that she thinks slavery is the next thing to hell. So it says, state right here, I think slavery is the next thing to hell. And when you look at the Confederate monument today in Virginia, the Robert E. Lee one, you will see that the Black Lives Matter movement often projects an image of an individual on the statue. Most times it is about Harriet Tubman. It states that quote. Right now it's about Representative John Lewis and his passing. So here, this is about William Still. He was one of the leading Underground Railroad agents in Philadelphia. In 1855, he took a tour of Canada West. It was supposed to be sponsored by the New York Tribune, but nobody can find those accounts. Of course, if he was touring Canada West, he would have interviewed people here in St. Catharines. So the closest connection we have to him communicating with people in St. Catharines other than Harriet Tubman is this broadside that's housed at Brock University. It's part of the Rick Bell collection. And right on the side, he says, he's telling one of the Bell ancestors to say hello to his friends in St. Catharines. This display here is about the Welland House Hotel. It was constructed using the labor of freedom seekers, fugitive slaves, those that arrived by way of the Underground Railroad. I point out this hotel for two reasons. Number one, built predominantly by African American freedom seekers. And number two, St. Catharines was a major tourist attraction. We had many things going on here. Tourism was one of them, so that helped support the economy. Those that were visiting were slaveholders. Many would flock to this area, especially after the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law passed. And that's because they really weren't welcome in the free northern states. There, many of them were abused. They complained about being beat up because they were bringing their enslaved people with them. In the free northern states, a lot of enslaved people were coerced into separating from their enslaver and escaping to freedom. So that's why many of them decided they'd bypass the free northern states and venture to Canada. So when southern white folks arrived in St. Catharines, they were not with the people they were enslaving. Here we have some more information about another arrival, but I want to go to the Suspension Bridge. This is where Harriet Tubman crossed, and it's the only documented crossing point for her entering Canada. Where she crossed prior to 1855, we don't know. Maybe the Lower Suspension Bridge, Queenston-Lewiston, or perhaps Buffalo Black Rock. There's no documented accounts. So from Buffalo Black Rock, she would be crossing into Ontario. So those are just anybody's best guess. So those are for the rescue missions that predate 1855. What we do know, after 1855, she rode the train. Back then, they called it cars. Her only documented account crossing that area speaks to her amazement about Niagara Falls. In this rescue mission, she's piloting Joe Bailey, his brother, William, and another gentleman by the name of Peter Pennington. It would normally take Harriet Tubman and her passengers, when they were escaping, a day or two to get out of Maryland and make it to Wilmington, Delaware. With Joe Bailey and this rescue, it took 2 weeks. The reward for Peter Pennington was high. Joe Bailey's brother was about $300, but Joe Bailey was a prized enslaved black man. The reward for him in the state of Maryland was $1,500. Out of state, $2,000. That amount was astronomical at the time. Everybody was after him. Law enforcement, slave catchers, bounty hunters. 2 weeks they were hiding in Maryland, in potato holes. A lot of people would not shelter them because the rewards were so high. But Tubman, because she believed in the Lord, prayed up on it, and she was successful. They managed to make it to Delaware. They made it to Philadelphia, where William Still put them on the train and pushed them right through to New York City. When you were working on the Underground Railroad, the rule was, say nothing. At the stations, if the individual was in hot pursuit, the rule was to say nothing. When they arrived in New York City, they stopped at the Anti-Slavery Society. One of the people who was working there, and it was either Oliver Johnson or Sidney Howard Gay, had the audacity to show Joe Bailey his reward poster, because Joe Bailey had a distinct look. He had a scar on the left side of his face. Joe Bailey, of course, could not read or write. That was denied to any person who was enslaved in the United States. Harriet Tubman herself could not read or write. They were denied an education. But when he looked at the visual image of himself, he knew that bounty hunters were after him. So now he's in New York City. His first question was, how long is it going to take to get to that suspension bridge? They explained to him, and they even showed him a map. Joe Bailey was fearful. He wanted to turn back. He actually wanted to return to slavery because he was so afraid of being captured, whipped and abused, or perhaps killed, or at the very least a foot cut off, or maimed in some manner. The other two wanted to continue, and of course, Harriet Tubman, who was known as Moses at the time, she was not turning back. Joe Bailey had to get on that train, and he did, from New York City all the way to Suspension Bridge. So we're talking almost a day's journey. He sat hunched over with his face in his hands. He was so fearful. In the meantime, others along the route, Syracuse, New York, they had to bypass it because there was no money for them to fund the Underground Railroad. So the Underground Railroad was funded. People would pool their money together to either shelter individuals, give them food, or give them money so they could continue their journey. Well, a lot of people were tapped out at the time. Harriet Tubman managed to get him to Suspension Bridge. And when I said earlier that she marveled at Suspension Bridge, in this only documented account, they're now crossing the bridge on a slow crawl, and Tubman's telling him, Joe, look at the falls, and he would still not look. They're in the middle of the bridge, gives you a clear view of the falls, and she's telling him, Joe, look at the falls, and he would not. So they got to the Canadian side. They're now on British soil. They're free. Joe Bailey's out of the train, so he's off the car, and he's screaming, he's praising the Lord, thank you. Now he's free. And Tubman says, the least you could have done was look at the falls. In the town of St. Catharines, at the time of Harriet Tubman, North Street was considered the Broadway of the colored village. St. Paul Street, of course, was the Broadway of the entire town. So throughout the displays, you will see images, old images of St. Paul Street. Harriet Tubman was also paid for hire, and we know this because there's an 1856 account of her here in St. Catharines. A black male who was once enslaved and fled from bondage approached her and asked her to go back to the U.S. to rescue his fiancée. Her name was Tilly. Tubman agreed to do that because he was paying. She went back to Maryland, couldn't find Tilly because even though the instructions were put out in advance, and that could be done because the communication network was strong and people used telegraphs at the time. So when Tubman reached her destination on the date that was scheduled, Tilly was nowhere to be found. The safe house that Tubman went to, the people living there told her Tilly was too frightened, so she took off. So now Tubman has to search for Tilly. When she finds her, she's a nervous wreck. Tubman decides, you know what? There's rewards for Tilly. Slave catchers are everywhere. So she devised a new plan. Instead of traveling north to freedom, they boarded a boat and traveled south and went around Maryland. And they were impersonating free black women. That allowed them to escape to St. Catharines. Tubman was known to give, a lot of people instructions. This is a picture of the Cambridge 8. So this incident took place in October and November of 1857. The total number of people that escaped, she didn't guide them, is 44. So 2 different occasions. And this picture was included in William Still's book, The Underground Railroad. So after the Civil War, William Still, who used to document all the accounts of the individuals who arrived at his station, who had escaped from slavery, he would collect their narratives. And after the Civil War in 1872, he published them. And included in that publication is this depiction of the Cambridge 8 that Tubman is known to have aided. So I mentioned earlier that the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act upset a lot of white people who were living in the free states. One of those white people was John Brown. greatest white abolitionist to ever live. He was a staunch abolitionist, so much to the point that he decided he was going to devise a plan to overthrow slavery. In 1858, he met with Frederick Douglass in Rochester, New York, and there he began to write out his provisional constitution, what the rules would be after he overtook the government. By April, he was here and he was meeting Harriet Tubman. He met with her and a group of the people that she had rescued, so black males. Her parents were here at the time, so of course she would have included her father and her 3 brothers in that group, plus a number of other men. Harriet Tubman agreed to go with him when it was time to overtake a federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. So John Brown was here for a total of 10 days. Then he moved on to Ingersoll and then Chatham, where he completed his address to the black community, black males, about his wanting to overtake the government and, of course, completing the provisional constitution. Once all that was done, the document was sent back here to St. Catharines, where William Howard Day, who was educated at Oberlin College, he was a great orator, and of course, he could read or write, and he was a printer. He published them from this location for John Brown. While this was happening, one of his trusted friends, John Brown's, one of his trusted friends by the name of Hugh Forbes decided, you know what, he wanted more money from John Brown. And his role in this group or this party was to train individuals who would join John Brown in military combat. Well, Hugh Forbes wanted more money because they were short of money. Hugh Forbes decided, you know what, we're going to rat you out. He wrote letters about John Brown's plans, and thank God he wrote those letters to white abolitionists. Some were American politicians, others were newspaper publishers. What he did not do was write to Southerners or Southern congressmen and let them know about John Brown's plans. Nevertheless, that frightened many people, so they put the plans on hold. It should have occurred, the overthrow of Harper's Ferry, in the summer of 1858. It did not. It did not occur until October 16, 1859. Because of the time that was in between both dates, many people who were in support of John Brown and said that they would assist him, they didn't show up when it was time for the attack. Tubman did not show up. They indicate that she was nowhere to be found. Some say she was in New Bedford. Tubman herself said that she was in New York City. So a lot of people weren't aware. Plus, the date changed. It was supposed to take place on October 27th when it actually occurred on October 16th. There were many people that John Brown was communicating with who were telling him, you know, it wasn't such a great plan and do not do it. One of those people was Frederick Douglass. So he met John Brown a month earlier before the raid on Harper's Ferry, and Frederick Douglass told him, I cannot be here to assist you. I would hope that you would reconsider. John Brown would not, so Frederick Douglass wished him well with his plans. John Brown was captured on October 16, 1859. He had 21 men with him. 5 were men of African descent, so black males, 1 Canadian. On December 2nd, John Brown was hung for treason. He was a great humanitarian, and he went out swinging. Said he would do it again if he was given that opportunity, because he was against slavery and he wanted it to come to an end. So the number one question about Harriet Tubman is, what did she do in St. Catharines? There's not a lot of documentation. As I indicated earlier, we know that she was paid for hire. We know where she lived, in a boarding house with her elderly parents, and that was, on North Street, just behind the church. So we know that she operated a boarding house. That's where her parents were living with her, and she sheltered fugitive slaves. There's a possibility that she even worked in the hotel industry, because that's what she did in Philadelphia and Cape May, New Jersey. There's just no documentation. There's an account of her saying that she worked in the hotels in Philadelphia. There's an account saying that she was in Cape May, but there's no account of what she did here. She would have had to have survived, so we know that that opportunity was available for her, the employment opportunity. This entire display here is about Harriet Tubman and the people she was connected with during the Underground Railroad. I said before that I was going to mention Frederick Douglass again. Here he is right here. So, Harriet Tubman's journey. She would start point anywhere in Maryland, sometimes Baltimore. Didn't necessarily mean Baltimore. Wilmington, Delaware, where she would connect and receive assistance from Thomas Garrett. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, William Still. Then we have New York City, where there would have been Oliver Johnson, Sidney Howard Day. Albany, New York, where she would receive assistance from Stephen Myers. Then, of course, Syracuse, New York, Jermaine Logan, who was a frequent visitor here to St. Catharines, Frederick Douglass in Rochester, and then Hiram Wilson here in St. Catharines. There's no image of Hiram Wilson. He was a white man here at the time when Harriet Tubman lived here in St. Catharines, and he was the person that all these other individuals communicated with. There was on occasion where individuals who were escaping, including Harriet Tubman, would stop in Elmira, New York, and they would receive assistance from John Jones. The reason this is up here is Frederick Douglass, in his account of his 1881 biography, states all the locations that I mentioned, and he states St. Catharines, Canada West, as being the last stop of the Underground Railroad terminus that he was connected with. And all I can say is, thank you, Brother Douglass, for putting us on the map and making it known. This is an image of William Wells Brown. He also was a frequent visitor to St. Catharines, so there's about 4 documented accounts of him being in this area. In 1860, he wrote for the Palm and Pine an account about the colored village here in St. Catharines, saying that, you know what, they had their own homesteads, all paid for, so no mortgages. Some were farmers, some were entrepreneurs, some were omnibus drivers. So he pretty much told a story about the black community here in St. Catharines. I mentioned earlier about what Harriet Tubman did. There was one other thing that she did that was equally important. She established a fugitive aid society here in St. Catharines, and that was to shelter individuals and help them along their way. Some remained here in St. Catharines and others moved on. So she did this shortly before the Civil War. And this image here depicts that, and here's members of that committee. What I found out in researching some of the members is that after the Civil War, we know that a lot of people returned to their homestead. So they were now free to go back to the United States and look for their loved ones. Some did that, some settled in the South again. But others, based on this research, and I'm speaking about Horatio Wilkinson, he decided that, you know what, I'll relocate to Chicago. So from that account, tracing his history, I found out that many others here, they did not go back to the South in search of their families. A lot of them moved to major cities in the US, such as Chicago and New York. Some moved to Philadelphia. So this is the newest picture of Harriet Tubman. It was discovered a few years ago. One of her colleagues, a friend, Emily Howland, had it in her collection. When it was discovered, of course, there was a lot of excitement. It was purchased along with a number of other photographs, and it is now in the, I can't say ownership because it's part of the public domain, but the Library of Congress is part owner, as well as the African American Museum, the Smithsonian in the United States. So that's the picture of Harriet Tubman. And that was taken anywhere between 5 and 7 years after she left St. Catharines. So she was a tiny woman, very tiny, petite, and very, very graceful. You can see that. It's a stark contrast to her being the Moses of her people and the fierce, courageous woman who was going back to Maryland to guide people to freedom here in St. Catharines. This is about her passing in Auburn, New York. So after she left St. Catharines, she moved to Auburn, New York. That's where she settled. She remained there until she died on March 10th, 1913. One obituary, Canadian obituary for Harriet Tubman, and that was written by Reverend Ball. Reverend Ball was a young man living here in St. Catharines when she was the Moses of her people. St. Catharines didn't write an account for her, so he did it from Toronto, and this is her only Canadian account. When she passed, she still had 5 descendants here living in the St. Catharines area and 1 in Cayuga, and they are listed on her last will and testament. This is about Zion Baptist Church because we weren't the only black church here in St. Catharines. Zion Baptist Church's most famous member is Reverend Anthony Burns. In 1854, he escaped from slavery in Virginia, made it to Boston, and under that 1850 fugitive slave law, he made the mistake of acknowledging his slaveholder who was in hot pursuit. So his enslaver confronts him on the street, Burns acknowledges him, then he's arrested, taken to the courthouse. As luck would have it, Henry Dana leading abolitionist, a white male at the time, is in the courthouse, and he decides he'll defend Burns. Riotings break out. The Liberty Bell was rung. People are trying to free Burns. It doesn't happen. A U.S. Marshal was shot. It took the government 5 days to calm the rioting. People in Boston, who were known to be staunch abolitionists, would drape coffins in black and hang them from their places of business, and then liberty laws were enforced. But with Burns, he was returned to slavery. So now we have 22 members of law enforcement, whether they're part of the cavalry, U.S. Marshals, local police, slave catchers, on horseback with guns, rifles, shotguns, trying to calm the rioters so that his enslaver could take him to the boat, put him on board a ship, and sail him back to Virginia. Now he's in Virginia, he's enslaved once again. His friends in Boston never forgot him. They tried to purchase his freedom. His enslaver said no. He was tired of being harassed by the white abolitionists, the Yankees in Boston, so he, in turn, sold Burns to another enslaver in North Carolina. His friends in Boston decided, okay, we'll fix you. They hatched a plan. Got a white man to pretend he was a Southerner, gave him $1,200. He went to North Carolina and purchased Burns with abolitionist gold. That's what they called it at the time, abolitionist money. So they tricked him. Burns is now back in Boston. He's traveling to New York City. P.T. Barnum of the Barnum and Bailey Circus. At the time, he owned a museum. It was called the New York Museum. The New York American Museum, excuse me. He offers Burns $100 to tell his story on the lecture circuit. And Burns said, no, you're not parading me around like a monkey, and I'm not telling my story next to the Siamese twins, the bearded lady, and all these other carnival freaks of nature, because that's what the museum was. So he accepted an offer from a white woman who was a Quaker abolitionist. He went to Oberlin College, studied theology. After he received his degree, he moved on to Indiana. They found out, white folks there found out it was Anthony Burns. They thought he would agitate the free blacks, and they forced him out based on their black codes. Zion Baptist Church was without a pastor. He arrived in St. Catharines in 1860. Zion Baptist Church was in financial ruin. He turned all that around. He became a revered member of the community. 2 years later, he died. He was very ill. He passed on at the age of 28. His plaque was erected by these white men, these gentlemen. They were part of St. Catharines Lincoln Historical Society in 1964, along with the stewardess of the Zion Baptist Church, Clara Bell Williams. They were without a minister, so our minister stepped in, Reverend Francis. That's how Burns is remembered. The white males of the St. Catharines Lincoln Historical Society in 1964 did not want to forget about him, and his plaque is one of the first plaques in Ontario to be dedicated to a person of African descent. Again, I want to say it was an honor for me to participate in this 186th Emancipation Day event. So I want to give a shout out to Matter of Black and Black Owned 905 and all other supporters of this event. Again, it's an honor for me to represent the Salem Chapel as a trustee and the church historian. And I also want to let you know one more time that I am the owner and operator of Tubman Tours Canada. What we did today is just a glimpse in what I do for the tours. Upstairs, the church has a lot of artifacts, a lot of memorabilia that you'd be able to look at. And on my tour, we go out throughout the downtown core where we're talking about white abolitionists. We're looking at a lot of the historic sites here in St. Catharines. And my tour is a little bit different. It is off the beaten path because we include the enslavers that were here in Niagara. We include the enslaved people that were here in Niagara. And more importantly, my tours are fact-checked in real time. Stay away from a lot of the oral history because you cannot really speak to that. And people want to be able to fact-check in real time. Again, thank you for listening and a happy Emancipation Day.